see all these fabulous people coming out tonight. Very excited to have Vandana Shiva here opening our 8th annual Advocacy Conference. Our conference this year is called Reasserting the Public Good in a Corporatized World. And who better to have kick off that conversation for a whole weekend of conversation than Dr. Vandana Shiva. I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Bill Marshall-Gannon. I'm the Executive Director of Public Interest Alberta. Way more rowdy than a Calgary crowd last night. We had 600 in Calgary last night, 700 here, so. You guys are close to Calgary, you want to make them feel welcome. So just a few words about Public Interest Alberta. We are a nonpartisan advocacy organization, but what we do is very, very political. Here in Alberta, we need to mobilize our citizens to stand up and speak out for what matters to you, to your families, to the environment, to this community, and that's what we've been doing for almost 10 years, and that's what this conference is about. We survive only on the support of our members, so if you're not already an individual member, we do encourage you to consider taking out a membership. That helps us put on events like this, that helps us do our various advocacy works. And we have very many organizational members, and in particular we have 4 large sponsor members, and I really want to thank the United Nurses of Alberta, the Alberta Teachers Association, the Health Science Association of Alberta, and the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees. I also want to recognize tonight that we have a very special conference sponsor again this year. A big thank you to the Civic Services Union Local 52, our fabulous municipal workers, very generous contribution. And of course, we work very closely with our partner groups, Friends of Medicare and the Parkland Institute. Friends of Medicare has brought in a few of our speakers for the Canadian Health Coalition Tour. And of course, Parkland we work very closely with, and so it's been good. Our media sponsor is none other than View Weekly. We're really thrilled to have their support. And as well, a special thank you to 2 groups at the University of Alberta who contacted us. We said, you know, there's a number of low-income people, there's students, etc., who may not be able to afford the $20 for tonight. They bought 100 tickets to give away to students and low-income people. It's the Sustainable Youth and the Gender-Based Violence Prevention Project. So again, thank you for them, all of them. Again, this conference would also not be possible without an incredible number of volunteers. So thanks to all the Next Up folks from Calgary and from Edmonton who came out, and all our volunteers. And I know she's not in the room because she's always working incredibly hard, but Karen Worley. All right. I want to start off also by recognizing that we are on Treaty 8 territory. As Vandana will talk about tonight, Treaty 6. Well, not thank you, Treaty 6. And, as Vandana will talk about tonight, it's time for us to understand the roots of colonialism, and particularly just because Edmonton just hosted the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final hearings. I know we have a long way to go in healing that relationship, and at the end of the day, we're all treaty people. We're all signatories to treaties, so we want to start by recognizing that. Next, I want to invite up a good friend of mine, a former board member of Public Interest Alberta, and now a city councillor of the City of Edmonton, Councillor Amarjeet Sohi, to give a welcome from the City of Edmonton.
Well, thanks, Bill. It is amazing to see so many people in this room who are committed to social justice, who are committed to ensure that our public services, our public institutions continue to enhance the quality of life for all Albertans. And that would not have been possible without the work of my friend Bill, right? And many members of BIA, the board members, staff, Karen, and everyone else. BIA is one of those organizations I had the chance to sit on the board for a brief time. But I can tell you that Alberta would not be the place without the advocacy work of Public Interest Alberta. The services that we enjoy, the quality of life that we enjoy today, and the hard work that goes to ensure that our governments and our institutions are held accountable. That is the work Public Interest Alberta does. And so on behalf of Mayor Don Avison and entire City Council, I want to extend my greetings to all of you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being a movement to make Alberta a better place for all of us to live in. And also I want to welcome Dr. Shiva. We on March 23rd, a group of us came together to mark the day to remember Shahid Bhagat Singh, who was a freedom fighter in India, who was a revolutionary, and at the age of 23, he was executed by the British government. And each year we come together here in the city, in our city, to mark that day. And at that day I had a chance to convey the message about this conference, and we had a brief chat with Dr. Raj Prenu, who had the chance to introduce you last time you were here. And the way he described you, I was just amazed to see the energy and the work that you have done to promote democracy, environmentalism, and everything else. So I really want to extend the warmest welcome to you on behalf of all of us, on behalf of Edmontonians and our City Council. So thank you so much for being here. I'm pretty sure there's something that's about you that we were able to attract 700 people in this room today. And I'm really glad that we did help you with this. So thank you so much.
Next, I'd like to call up our board chair and founder of Public Interest Alberta, Larry Boyd, to give us a bit of an overview and a context to kick off the conference. So come on up, Larry. Welcome.
I'm going to be very brief because I do know why you're here. Actually, we have two groups here tonight. The first group is people who really, really wanted to see Vandana Shiva, and the second group is people who really, really wanted to see Vandana Shiva and come to our conference. And so Bill has asked me to just very quickly talk just for a moment about the connection between those two things. We've been around in Public Interest Alberta for 10 years. As Bill said, as an advocacy organization. We're not a lobbying organization. We don't do that. In fact, we couldn't get in the door. We're an advocacy organization trying to work with public, with citizens, to put pressure on that government to move things in the right kind of direction. And as a part of that, we're doing this all the time, all year. But we have a special time during the year for our annual advocacy conference, where we do very particular things. The principle, by the way, was well articulated by Canadian Labour leader Buzz Hargrove, who said, fighting back makes a difference. And you all know that, but you also know that fighting back in smart and effective ways makes a bigger difference. And so what we try to do at this conference is very much to help you learn more from each other and from these wonderful speakers about how to fight back and make that difference. And never doubt that it makes a difference. You know, Public Interest Alberta has 8 task forces. We work in areas like seniors and child care and K-12 education and post-secondary and human services and poverty. Just mention very quickly what our seniors task force did in this last year, because some of you, actually eventually all of you, are going to be the beneficiaries of it. And the seniors task force has taken this powerful government on a number of fronts, but one of them was on their plan to get rid of another universal program, and in particular to introduce a means-tested pharmaceuticals program to save, I think they said $180 million. Our seniors task force went around the province and in 13 locations held public forums, and then they said, you know, they're not listening, and they occupied the office of Fred Horn, and I see a number of you in this room were in that office. It was very interesting. This powerful majority government backed away and said, you know what, I guess we're not going to go ahead with a means-tested pharmaceuticals program. Fighting back makes a difference, and fighting back in smart and effective ways makes an even bigger difference. So the heart of this conference, and by the way, I know that most of you are here to hear this evening's speaker, and good, but maybe as you think during the next year about how you yourselves are fighting back for these causes. And by the way, we're very focused on public services, public good, public spaces, the public interest, and promoting those, not just defending an inadequate status quo, but promoting improvements in that area. But when you think about it and how you're doing it, maybe what you want to do is get involved in this organization or one like it, and learn more about how to fight back effectively. That's what this conference is about. And Bill is going to actually introduce Dr. Shiva. But I'll tell you that in terms of fighting back effectively, I'm not sure there's anybody on the planet that we could have invited to give you better advice on how to do that. Thank you very much.
So it is my very great pleasure to introduce Vandana Shiva. Obviously, the turnout means that so many of you know about Dr. Shiva and the work that she's done in so many different areas. What you may not know is she actually has 2 university degrees, an MA and a PhD from Canadian universities in particle physics. She is her PhD at the University of Western Ontario, and philosophy. She went back to India in 1982. She founded the Research Foundation for Science, Technology, and Ecology. And later in 1991, she founded Navdanya, a national movement to protect the diversity of living resources. That movement has been very successful. They have conserved more than 2,000 varieties of rice. They have successfully fought against the biopiracy of the neem tree, basmati rice, and wheat varieties in India. She has been an incredible spokesperson fighting for farmers, but in particular the role of women farmers, and for indigenous knowledge. She's no slouch at all. She's the author of more than 20 books, of course. I don't know how she does it, but 20 books is very impressive. And I had the pleasure of meeting Vandana on a number of occasions at different points over time. I was executive director of the Parkland Institute when we invited Vandana Shiva here in 1999. We were reminiscing about that particular conference because that was just before the World Trade Organization meetings in Seattle. And Vandana Shiva is on the board of directors of the International Forum on Globalization, which is a group of amazing people like Maud Barlow and others from around the world who worked for years and years to try and help people understand the role of the WTO and the implications of that. And I remember standing with Maud in the stadium in 1999 where there were 40,000 people ready to march through the streets of Seattle against the WTO. And it was years and years of work coming to fruition. And Vandana was very much there, very present in that fight. And again, when we met in Cancun, for the World Trade Organization's meetings in 2003. I was Director of Campaigns and Communications for the Council of Canadians at the time, working out of Ottawa. And of course, so much of the work of Vandana is working with the peasant farmers. And she was involved in a very large march that the farmers had organized, about 10,000 farmers from around the world. And in particular, I remember we were a group of internationals that were there, along with the president of the National Farmers Union from Korea. Unfortunately, our media here in Canada and the US did not cover this, but it was absolute front page news around the world, because Mr. Lee, the president of the Farmers Union in Korea, had been spending years going to console widows of farmers who had taken their lives because they had lost their land due to globalization. Mr. Lee, at the WTO meetings at the end of the 10,000 people march, climbed up on the fence where the military had set up and separated the place from all the protesters on the outside, and he took his own life there. Mr. Lee was a very famous man in Korea. He was the first Korean to climb Mount Everest, and of course that was shocked around the world. But he was very clear about the impact of globalization, and I know Vandana will be speaking as well about the farmers in India who have also taken their lives. The last little story, just to also give you an insight into who this amazing woman is. I had the pleasure of traveling with her in India. We were there for the World Social Forum in 2004 in Mumbai. We had organized a big water conference in Delhi that Vandana was very involved in. But the best part of it was going to Kerala, to Pachamara, where Coca-Cola plant had been draining the aquifers of this valley, and the farmers were struggling to get enough water. Well, we were there with Margaro, my boss at the time, Vandana, the president of the National Farmers Union in France, José Bové, a very famous man who famous for driving his tractor into a McDonald's, to take out the McDonald's. He proudly José's a troublemaker extraordinaire, lots of fun. So we had this conference a couple of blocks away from the main gates of the Coca-Cola plant. And a very ornate gates, beautiful plant. And there were women, farmers, who had been staging a sit-in for 400 days when we were there, sitting in front of that plant every day. So after Maud and Vandana had done their keynotes that morning, I said, we had lunch, so let's just go for a walk. So they started to walk. And then the whole conference emptied out and followed them. And before we knew it, we had 2,000, 3,000 people marching towards the gates of the Coca-Cola plant. You could imagine the Indian police were coming from everywhere, the media were coming from everywhere. So there I was, squished against the gate, Vandana on one side of me, trying to film all of this, and José Bové on the other side. And the manager of the Coca-Cola plant comes out. It's in some of the movies that are out there. And Vandana, they said, we'll let the international guests come in and we'll talk to them. She says, no, we are here as guests of the farmers, of the leaders locally. We will not come in unless you agree to let them in. And so she had this intense argument beside her. Meanwhile, José Bové is standing beside me speaking to me in French. He starts rocking the gate. He says, come on, Bill, we can take this gate down. And José, no, it's so So it was a very powerful time. And so Vandana will tell you the results of that very powerful story as we go forward. So I'd like you to join me. Vandana's going to take us on a walk down the path of where we need to go towards a path towards Earth democracy. So let's give her a very big Edmonton welcome.
Particular pleasure to be here for this conference at this time. The fact that 700 You care and you know you can make a difference. I've always cared deeply about knowledge, which is why I came all the way to Canada to follow my questioning and inquiry from particle physics to quantum theory. And the Canada of that period, which was 75 to 79, not only had the University of Western Ontario attracted the best minds working on quantum theory from around the world. The colloquium on quantum theory, if you do a market-based analysis of the best minds working on the foundations of quantum theory, it just wouldn't justify it. But they did, and that's why I came here. And I went back because I just feel so grateful to my country. I feel grateful to everything I've received from my grandfather, who gave his life for women's education. Because in that period of our independence movement and soon after, if you wanted to work for society and people weren't listening, in India people went on fasts. And he went on a fast and actually died. And a mother who refused to give up her own freedom, and therefore it was second nature for us to know we are equal. We are not the second sex. But I had also got involved in this very beautiful movement of women coming out in the villages of my region, the Garhwal Himalaya, when the forests were being cut and landslides were starting and flooding was starting, and they said, we're going to hug the trees, you have to kill us before you kill the trees. Because we had a huge legacy around the forest issue, because forests used to be the commons. Till the late 19th century, forests belonged to the people and were the commons. And by then the British had run out of all their timber because they cut all their oaks for shipbuilding, and they needed to now take away these forests. So they did the typical enclosures of the forest, just declared it state property for commercial use. And we had generations and generations trying to reclaim forests as a commons, and Chico was part of that. But what it added was the new dimension of fighting back with the deepest love. Because I don't think any fight is strong if it doesn't come from a place of love. Love for people, love for life, love for the planet. Of course, my world of quantum theory is very far away from what I do today, except in the fact that my thesis was on non-separability of quantum theory. Because mechanical assumptions make us believe that the world is made of immutable hard objects that are all separate, and the only way they can interact is through violence, which is called action by contact. And quantum theory showed us that there's action at a distance, because everything is anyway connected, and if it's connected, a particle here affecting a particle light years away is not a mystery. We live in an interconnected world. But so much of the problems that we face at the ecological level, at the economic level, at the level of democracy, come from very well-crafted separations and divisions. The first separation is from nature. Apartheid is the word for separation that became an entire regime in South Africa. And the fact that apartheid came down with global solidarity shows what we can do as people. I remember in those days, Indian passports had stamps. There were two countries we could not visit as Indians. One was South Africa, because of apartheid, and the other was Israel. We couldn't. Now, of course, those exclusions have been removed. I call the separation from nature, imagined separation from nature, because it's all in the head. It can't can't be through our breath, because if we stop breathing, the oxygen that the trees give us, we won't be alive. If we stop drinking the water the earth gives us, the rivers give us, we won't be alive. If we stop eating the food that comes from the seed and the soil and the sun, we won't be alive. The earth is the very condition of our being. We are part of the earth, not separate from it. And yet an entire worldview has been constructed on separation, which I call equal apartheid. It was built with very careful thinking during what is called the rise of the scientific revolution, where people like Bacon, people like Newton later, people like Descartes, first decided that the earth was dead and mere matter to be exploited, which is raw material. And Bacon created an idea of a superior knowledge that came from subjugating nature. As he wrote, that the rise of scientific knowledge must depend on mechanical philosophy that leads to not merely exerting a gentle guidance over nature's course, they have the power to conquer and subdue her, shake her to her very foundations. And he called this process, very self-consciously, the birth of masculine pride. He wrote a book on it. And then the Royal Society of England was created as the leading scientific body. But its entire objective was to raise a masculine philosophy, which was a mechanical philosophy, which was a reductionist philosophy, and all done to establish man's empire over the earth. It took a long time for that thinking to become what we now assume as the only mode of thinking, but it also took a lot of violence. Violence against indigenous people everywhere, violence against women. The witch hunts were about subjugating another way of knowing, a way of knowing that was much more in coherence and harmony with nature's processes. The separation that was artificially constructed, of course, went hand in hand with dividing an interconnected world into these artificially constructed, immutable billiard balls, I call them. Newton said, God made the world immutable particles. And that's how it has to be, as if only they communicate with God. And though it was a few hundred years ago, that's the kind of thinking that is today guiding so much of the disciplines that shape the way we grow our food and what food becomes. And my deep departure from a world of science at the level of quantum theory, but a science of a different kind, really came with the 1984 violence in Punjab and the violence in Bhopal. Now, Punjab was the land where the Green Revolution, based on these reductionist and mechanistic ideas, was first implemented. And it was called science, but it had really come out of the war. Every element of industrial agriculture has come from war. The chemical fertilizers came from the explosive factories. The pesticides were designed partly for chemical warfare, partly to kill people in concentration camps. And when the wars were over, an industry that had got addicted to profits didn't want to give up. So they redesigned the entire working of agriculture to adapt it to war chemicals. But they also changed our minds to imagine we couldn't grow food without poisons. Punjab was where this was first applied in the Third World, 1965-66. And the name given was the Green Revolution. It was not very green, it wasn't at all revolutionary. Within a decade, as the subsidies that had allowed to happen were withdrawn, farmers started to get into debt. And indebted farmers started to rise and protest. And the year 84, actually the period when the Golden Temple was invaded by the army, farmers' protests were happening, and farmers had decided we are not going to supply grain till we get justice. But nowhere in the records do you even find what the farmers were protesting. Just prices. Freedom to grow the crops they wanted to grow, not be forced to grow just rice and wheat as commodities with huge inputs, to have access to their own water. That's when I went to Punjab to study the Green Revolution. Went back to Punjab because I'd done my MSc in particle physics from the University of Punjab. But that same year we had the disaster of Bhopal, where I woke up to the violence that's intrinsic to the chemicals used in agriculture. 3,000 people were killed immediately, 30,000 since then, and hundreds of thousands are being born crippled. 30 years since Bhopal, and the people of Bhopal don't yet have justice. Largely women continue to fight. How did we manage to convert the production of food, which is life, into war? The conversion of people who really are the original inhabitants of the land into disposable people. What was the mindset that allowed it to happen, and what is that mindset doing to us today, and how is it so much at the root of contemporary challenges that we must face? We are part of the earth, we are part of an earth family. Not a species is born without a right to their food, to the water, to the air, because that's a condition for living. And that condition for life is a natural right. It isn't assigned by a state. It isn't assigned by a corporation. It's part of being part of the earth, part of being alive. We have a beautiful word for it in Indian philosophy and Indian everyday talk. It's Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the family of the earth. The earth family was first reduced to humans, but a reduction of the earth family to humans wasn't for all humans, because that same separation that divided in the mind humans from nature divided some privileged humans from most humanity. And the exclusions of the women, exclusions of indigenous people, exclusions of working people, were all rooted in that separation from nature, which went hand in hand with the other apartheid of divisions and separations based on race, on gender, on class, on every other artificial division that has been created. I have two friends in Switzerland, they're both men, and they were trying to analyze economic theory. And they said if the founders of capitalist theory had chosen a mother rather than a single bourgeois male as the smallest economic unit for their theoretical constructions, they would not have been able to formulate the axiom of the selfish nature of human beings in the way they did. So greed, which was a total assumption and was extrapolated on all beings, including human beings, through a small subset of greedy people who in normal societies are treated as outcasts. But they became the rulers. Now, the word capital is derived from caput in Latin. I know they use kaput for empty, finished. But kaput means the head, the one who rules. Wealth had other meanings. Wealth used to mean the state of well-being. It didn't even mean money. Money, which was just a mediator anyway, but wealth was the state of well-being. And if today, across the world, we are seeking well-being as the objective of human life, and needing to go beyond the economic assumptions of a very exploitative structure, it's because that's what economies are for. Aristotle made a big difference between oikonomia, the art of living, and chromatistics, the art of money-making. Art of money-making was never considered economy, because it doesn't generate life, it doesn't generate sustenance, it doesn't generate any of the processes, activities, goods and services that make life possible. In fact, the art of money-making takes life away, takes freedom away. The word oikos, which means home, is at the root of economy, which was supposed to be the management of the household, and the root of ecology, which is the science of the household, how nature works. Nature's laws are ecology. And the household is both the specific places where we live, but also our planetary home, of which we are citizens. And therefore, I always say, our first citizenship is as Earth citizens. Everything else is a derived citizenship. I always feel very grateful that I spent all those years of learning with the quanta. It was so harmless. Just the psi function. And I'm glad I visited so much of these fictions and abstractions created room when I'd gone through life's experience. I can't believe an economic theory that's been reduced to capital, labor, land. Capital, I said, is a fictitious way of making economic transactions and relationships, consolidated in the hands of a few, the head, and we give it imaginary creative power. When Locke was talking about the creation of property, he said, property is created every time human labor mixes with nature. Then he goes on to say, but the human labor that mixes with nature can't be the work of the woman or the slave or the animal. It is that mysterious labor that capital performs in absence somewhere far away. The owner. Land, which is really a summary of all of nature's amazing capacities. Nature's capacity to provide us water and air, food, soil and land. Land is just a summary, it is not a commodity. And labor for sure is not a commodity because it is the creative work and activity of human beings. The commodification, in effect, allows the appropriation. By declaring nature as dead, you remove all the limits that will come when you recognize nature's living. Because if nature's living, you have to think of the consequences, you have to tread very softly, your ecological footprint can't be heavy. When you realize you're dealing with people and their creative work, you don't declare them to be just a labor input. And then you don't manipulate all your calculations. By focusing on that one input and making it look like every time that input is reduced, you have more efficiency. I was giving a major lecture dedicated to one of our famous mathematicians and historians, D. Kosambi. And we had the founder and owner of one of India's biggest IT companies, Infosys, there, Mr. Narayan Murthy. Very smart guy, he's built a huge IT empire. And then he said, oh, we could make India a superpower, but this agriculture is dragging us back. If it wasn't for agriculture, we'd have very high levels of GDP. And the way to increase GDP in agriculture is to reduce the denominator. Just reduce the numbers of farmers. And that is how the definition of productivity has been. The US has the highest level of productivity in agriculture because they have the lowest number of farmers. But that doesn't mean they have the lowest use of resources. Behind every farmer are 300, 400 energy slaves. The fossil fuel, the oil, the gas. That use of energy slaves is what is messing up the climate stability of the world. And you don't produce more food with that artificial productivity defined by getting rid of the denominator. Because what is called the denominator, what is called the labor input, is actually the creative minds and hearts and hands of people who work, including farmers. That's where real production takes place. Real production takes place in nature. Real production takes place through people. And yet all of that production has been reduced to non-production. Because not only did we commodify land and labor and capital, during the war, we made an even more brilliant leap to mobilize resources for the war. Just as the chemicals for agriculture came from the war, the economic measure of GDP came from the war. It's very recent. The people woke up to me and said, how can we live without GDP? I said, surely we can live without something that existed only 60 years. Because we've lived before the wars. Now GDP literally creates a fictitious boundary called the production boundary. And this assumption of a production boundary just says, if you produce what you consume, you don't produce. So if a community produces for itself, it's not producing. If a nation is producing for itself, it's not producing. It's when you sell what you produce and you buy what you need, then you magically get an increase in GDP. The GDP only measures commercial transactions, not the circulation of well-being and life, not the circulation of health and happiness. And that is why tiny country in the Himalaya, Bhutan, and the Bhutan government has invited me to help them make a transition to 100% organic Bhutan. Because the last Prime Minister wrote and said, I want us to really grow happiness, because Bhutan decided years ago that they were not going to follow the illusion of GDP. Because they'd watched to see how every country with high GDP lived a miserable life. So we are going to measure happiness and well-being of our people. So their planning commission is the happiness commission. And it is not an empty concept of happiness. It is a substantial concept of happiness, rooted in the environment and what it provides, rooted in sustainable production and consumption systems, rooted in identity and knowing who you are. So across the world, these constructions and illusions are being given up by people who lose their minds. But they're being consolidated. The illusions are being deepened by those who created capital as the head that rules, and now have managed to elevate another fiction, which is just another name to the rich oligarchs, the fiction of the corporation, as a legal person. The East India Company became a corporation corporation because they were losing a lot of the bullion that had been stolen from the colonies. So they created the limited liability corporation. If we bring wealth back, it's ours, but if there's a loss, then all of society must bear it. That's how limited liability came to be born. And now, south of your border, you have the absolute cutting edge of illusion making. January 21st, in 2010, the US legalized the enclosure of democracy. Mutated, literally, democracy of being by the people, for the people, of the people, into being by the corporations, of the corporations, for the corporations, through removing all limits to financing elections. And as a commentator has said, the limit was treated as a violation of the corporation's civil liberties and freedom of speech. Now here's a fiction that doesn't exist, it's a piece of paper that allows a group of people to get incorporated. The reality is the people. And a lot of people say, you have some very harsh words about corporations. But they're also people. I said, no. The employees of Monsanto are people. Monsanto is a corporation, which is not a person, but we pretend it is a person. And I can hug the people of Monsanto, even while I fight them. But sadly, I can't hug Monsanto because it doesn't exist as a huggable entity. It wasn't born, it doesn't die, it doesn't fall sick, might lose some shareholders' profits. But this is what the commentator said. Even though they are artificial entities with greater access to capital, infinite longevity, and no interest in or connection to humanity, we now guarantee them the right of free speech. Freedom of speech was intended as a way for human beings to guarantee the ability to speak out against large systemic and structural repression. A corporation has not that same guarantee now. Except that they use that guarantee to do two things. Enclose two kinds of enclosures, of commons. The first commons are the parts of nature that have not yet been enclosed. The commons were enclosed in England, and all of these processes went hand in hand with the enclosure of the commons. The rise of mechanical philosophy, the rise of the capitalist philosophy. The new enclosures are the privatization of our water, our air, our biodiversity. And the second set of enclosures is to take all the public systems and the public services that have been built in response to the injustices of the system, in response to the exploitation of workers through workers' rights, in response to the threat to health, through the right to health and universal access to health, in response to the hunger created by exploitation, through the right to food, and in response to the denial of access to water through pollution, diversion, depletion, through the right to water. Those are the bases of life. And water, air, biodiversity are being enclosed today. So much of my own work in the last 3 decades has been to fight those enclosures and to defend and reclaim the commons. Bill talked about Plachimada in that village. That Coca-Cola plant is shut down. They tried to privatize Delhi's water supply, but that water supply was going to come from our Ganges River. And it was a company called Slates, which is the world's biggest water company. It is a Monsanto water. And I find it very interesting that every time they have to do something silly like this, they put an advertisement in the paper because they're so arrogant now about their narrative of progress. So they put up water in Delhi would be run by Sways. I knew about Sways. I've written my book, Water Wars. I've been part of the movement for keeping water out of the hands of corporations and defending water as a common good. So we started to build the movement for water democracy. 2000, the day I saw that ad. And we connected the people who were being displaced by the dam from where the water would come, along the river, the farmers who would lose their water, people in Haridwar, which is a very, very sacred pilgrimage site, where the biggest fair of the universe is organized. Self-organized, I should say. It's called the Kumbh Mela. Kumbh is a symbol of creation. And every 12 years, nowadays it's 30 million people come to bathe in the Ganges. People who are holding the Ganges sacred there. And then in the city, because the project was to take the water and only get it to the rich colonies, because that's where higher prices could be collected. And as is typical, they try to present it as an increase in water supply. Because for the rich it would mean more water, but it was at the cost of taking water away from the rural areas, it was at the cost of taking water away from the slums. In the World Bank calculations, public supply in the slums is water, is revenue loss and water theft. So we organized protests at the World Bank. I remember we had miles and miles and miles of a referendum cloth where people were signing. But should water be privatized? At the end of it, our chief minister panicked and said, okay, we won't privatize it. They only give up, like when you were talking about the means test, right? That's another strategy. Take a universal right to a common good, and then make it look like somehow the universal right is interfering in the rights of the bottom. They did it with our food issue. Food in India was a universal right. We used to have ration cards. Everyone had a ration card. It was universal access to affordable food, and the whole system worked to deliver food. It worked to get food from the farmers, and then get food to people. And the World Bank said, now 25 billion being spent is a waste of resources. Got to cut it. Target. The word they use in our countries is target. Here they say means. And it was all to reduce the budget. The budget has gone up to 500 billion to starve Indians. Every fourth Indian is hungry. Every second Indian child is wasted and stunted. Because the right to food was destroyed. Now, of course, they passed laws on food security, which are not about buying grain from the farmers, but about our tax money being used to buy on the international market. So maybe rice will cost 20 rupees a kilo, and the state will get it to some people at 2 rupees a kilo. But the state cannot regulate the prices nor guarantee fair prices to the farmers. The enclosures of the air are first through pumping so much pollution into the atmosphere that the climate is destabilized. And the greenhouse gases come largely from fossil fuels, from synthetic fertilizers, from factory farms. In my book, Soil Not Oil, I worked out how much was coming from an industrialized, globalized system of agriculture. And it was 40% and more. And that same system is destroying the work in farming with this false calculus of productivity is based on fewer people on the land. And as climate habit increases, there's new ways to find profit sources, new ways to enclose. Emissions trading was one. Let the polluters keep polluting, but let them buy non-pollution from someone who's not polluting. Does that bring down pollution? No, it doesn't. Anyone would know it. So this guy's polluting, this one isn't. You do a trade in fiction again. It doesn't. So they were supposed to reduce greenhouse gases by 5% in the Kyoto period. It's increased by 15% and still shooting up. And of course, your tar sands have huge contributions to it. Emissions trading wasn't enough. The World Bank said $1 billion of trade. Well, one man, Mittal, who now owns the steel plants of the world, he made $1 billion in 1 year while continuing to pollute. It's a bit like, I don't know, when the Catholic Church was losing its way, they used to have these things called indulgences. Yeah? Father, I've sinned. Go on, son, keep sinning. Just give me an indulgence. And in a way, emissions trading are today's global indulgences in a period of deep climate havoc, which is killing people. We lost 20,000 people in my region in this last monsoon because of extreme climate events. They go deeper and say, okay, now let us start owning the capacity of the leaves and the forests to absorb carbon dioxide and give out oxygen. Let's start owning the capacity of the soil to absorb carbon. Because organic farming, in my view, is the single biggest mitigation measure, because it puts organic living carbon into the soil. They're literally betting on Wall Street in terms of these ecological services of nature. And I just read this morning another fascinating idea that because there is climate change, and the interesting thing is the same people in one garb will say there's no climate change, and in another garb will go and invest in risk-taking in climate change. So of course, when climate changes, you're going to have floods, you need even better weather prediction systems. And so far, predicting the weather has been a public service. Rick Santorum, senator, I think, or congressman in the US, put out a bill 2005 to bar the National Weather Service in the US from issuing forecasts. They would continue to bear the burden of collecting the data. They would continue to invest in everything that it takes to monitor the weather, but they have to pass this data on to this company called AccuWeather. So every time someone wanted to know what's happening, you'd have to pay to AccuWeather. Well, that's an enclosure of a public service. And then the Monsantos, of course, take it even further. On the one hand, Monsanto just bought a corporation called Climate Corporation, whose only work is data on climate and weather. And they now want to use this as another additional way of controlling farmers. Because they're recognizing climate change is happening, and they're looking at how can we make more money. If you look at the language, my head just spins. It's data science for more reliable agriculture. Well, reliability in agriculture comes from knowing your soil, knowing your plants, knowing your animals, having the knowledge of the interconnections in agroecosystems, the discipline that we call agroecology. But the real enclosures, in my view, which is what has shaped so much of my work in contemporary times, is the enclosure of the living commons, the biodiversity, the seeds. Monsanto shaped this enclosure they admitted that the Intellectual Property Rights Agreement, particularly Article 27.3b of the TRIPS Agreement of WTO, was drafted by them. That's how I got involved in WTO and trade issues. They said we were the patient, diagnostician, and physician all in one. We defined a problem. The problem was farmers save seeds, in effect, seed is a commons. And they offered a solution, that farmers should be prevented from saving seeds by having seed declared their intellectual property. Yet another fiction. Here's a fiction called a corporation as a person. And suddenly this fiction has a brain and an intellect. And it can create property in products of the mind. It can even appropriate nature's evolution in the seed and call it their invention. Centuries of farmers breeding and knowledge and call it their invention. So I joke and say GMO in effect means God move over. And just like GDP was created through an artificial production boundary, intellectual property rights and patents and seed are created through an artificial creation boundary. That nature has no intelligence, nature doesn't reproduce, a seed doesn't reproduce on its own. Even a farmer working on a seed and growing a crop and harvesting it, no, that's not creation and production of any kind. It's the corporation that owns the seed through intellectual property, which is doing that real invisible labor. And across the world, not only are patent laws being imposed with serious consequences, but seed laws are being changed. You have the experience of what happened with Percy Smicer. His crop was contaminated. He should have been paid compensation. Instead, he was sued by Monsanto for $200,000. A farmer called Bauman in US bought grain from an elevator. And he planted his crop. And Monsanto said, no, you can't. All the seeds are ours. All future generations belong to us. And sadly, the Supreme Court, last year in February, upheld that. Which basically means nature does not produce. In India, India evolved cotton. We fought our freedom movement through cotton. Gandhi pulled out a spinning wheel and we had cotton. Spinning cotton became our Freedom Act. But Monsanto came in 97, 98 with its GMO BT cotton. And I was at a meeting in 1987 where the corporation said very clearly, the old chemical companies who were now taking over the seed, they said, we have to make sure that we do genetic engineering because that's the only way we can claim a patent. So they pushed this BT cotton. Within no time, 95% of all cotton seed sold in India is Monsanto. The price jumped 8,000%. It doesn't work to control pests. Farmers are using 30 times more pesticides. There's just reports from Bangladesh where another BT crop, the BT brinjal, is failing. Farmers are having to use pesticide. And the advertisement is you never need to use a pesticide because now the plant is producing its own pesticide. The debt for pesticides, the debt for seeds, and the frequent failures has trapped our cotton farmers in unpayable debt. And we witnessed the emergence of farmer suicides in the cotton belt, which has become a suicide belt. More than 284,000 farmers have committed suicide in India since globalization forced open our markets to global corporations. 95 to 2012, 284,000. That's more than a quarter million. I have called it a genocide. Because a genocide is deliberate harm to any community. And this is deliberate harm, knowing that your collecting royalties is going to push farmers into debt. And farmers not able to pay the debt will take a drastic step like ending their lives. And that's why the story of Lee that Bill mentioned in Cancun was to highlight the fact that globalization and corporate rule is killing farmers. Because we started this movement, I started in '87, I kept working with my government to make sure the kind of absolute ownership that the Monsantos were seeking didn't happen. We created a national working group on patent law. Most people were from the pharmaceutical side and the health side, and I was probably the only one looking at seed and food and agriculture. And we put it into our law, amended law, an Article 3D, which is a definition of what's an invention. It says just tinkering a little bit with a known invention is not an invention. Because the definition of invention is an obvious act, where you just make a drug which is 70%, 30%, turn it into 75%, 25%, that's not invention. And Novartis lost a case for monopolizing a cancer drug, which would have cost $150,000 for a month of treatment, compared to the $10,000 in the generic version. And when the judges said, but what you're asking for, the Indians can't afford, the Novartis lawyer said, we care about the 15% that can afford to pay. This is like a means test, isn't it? And of course, let's not forget that the chemical companies are the same as the seed corporations in the biotechnology industry and is the pharmaceutical industry. So the more cancers they give you, the more their market grows. So they want to use toxics. Across the world, these new laws are coming because actually GMOs haven't spread totally. Most seeds and most countries are GMO free. So the new trick is make it illegal for farmers to have their own seed. Which is going to be the new challenges we will face, where we have to be ready to deal with those who want to enclose the commons. As we defend the commons, they will try and criminalize the commons. I have worked in these last few years through the global campaign on seed freedom with Chile, Colombia, Europe, to stop these laws, and we've stopped them in all these countries. They're bringing a law like that to Canada in the garb of C18, Agricultural Growth Act. Growth of what? Profits for the corporations? It won't be growth of food, because the system of corporate agriculture is only allowing 10% of all the GMO corn and soya, which is all patented, for human food. The rest is all biofuel and animal feed. This is not a food system. It's not a food system at all. At best, it's an anti-food system because of all the toxics in it. This assumption that because corporations are bringing superior seeds, therefore they must have royalty, and they have bring superior seeds because they create food security. Every step of that argument is breaking apart. They're not bringing us food, they're creating commodities. Commodities are not food. Commodities don't feed people. 70% of the food eaten by humanity today comes from small farms and family farms, because they still grow food. The second level at which it doesn't work at all is because all of the industrial royalty collections are based on uniformity. But nature does not work on the principles of uniformity. Nature works on the principles of diversity, of quality, of resilience. That's also the principles that farmers use to evolve and breed their seed. That's why food from seeds bred by farmers is tasty, and the corporate food has no taste. That is why crops that are based on diversity have resilience, and the corporate uniformity and monocultures collapse. There too, not only has Monsanto bought Climate Corporation, it is trying to patent climate resilient crops. Now, climate resilient crops have been evolved by farmers over centuries. We've saved those seeds, 3,000 rice varieties in 110 community seed banks. Community seed banks because it is about the recovery of the commons. We distributed them after the Orissa supercyclone. And then the farmers of Orissa shared them with the farmers of the tsunami-hit coastal area of Tamil Nadu. Monsanto and friends have taken 1,500 patents on climate-resilient crops. They applied for such a patent in India, but because of our movements, we have an Article 3J. Because I always used to tell our government and our parliamentarians, life is not invented. Life makes itself. A seed planted grows into a seed without anyone's help. In the forest without even the farmer. In the prairies, it's just seeding itself. So we have a very strong article, which is 3J, that biological processes are not inventions. Monsanto's application was thrown out. Now Monsanto's using the Washington to threaten us, change your laws, which is something that happens all the time. But we are holding forward, because I believe recovery of the commons, whether it's the commons of water, the commons of air, the commons of creative work, the commons of biodiversity, the commons of our food, the commons of democracy, that these are such vital issues that the movements to reclaim them, to defend them, and then to reclaim them can only grow. Because what's being enclosed is the commons that allow us to live. And therefore what's being told to us is, we won't let you live. The means of staying alive will be our property. And of course they keep talking about taxes, but I see privatized water as tax collection by the corporations. I see royalty on seeds as tax collection by the corporation. All the time making us poorer. All the time making us more dependent. But very often when we don't have the means, not making us more dependent, just making us dispensable. As a community, we have the right to live. We have the right to be creative. We have the right to work. We have the right to produce the conditions of our life. Very clever constructions and fictions have defined what the human future is. Today, those fictions can no more be peddled as progress for humanity. That they can no more be peddled as the universal upliftment of all humankind. It's all about a handful of oligarchs hiding behind corporate form, trying to approach all the planet's wealth and all the collective wealth that people have collected, have created. We need to shift from these killing economies to living economies. From economies that have, from democracies that have been as good as killed because they're not working for people, to living democracies that we shape through our struggles, through our movements, and through our everyday practices. But most importantly, these cultures that have numbed us and taken over not just our lives, but our minds and our brains, we need to reclaim the ultimate commons that will allow us to reclaim all the other commons, our intelligence and our ability to think and create. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vandana. We have about 15 minutes, and we had asked via the net for some people to contact us and give us some questions, and we had a number from Calgary as well. So rather than doing the usual Q&A, I have some questions here. We'll just have a more formal or informal conversation and touch on some of these items a little bit more. At 8:30, we're going to have a reception. So there's an opportunity for people to stick around. Vandana will be signing books. We're very pleased that Audrey's Bookstore, one of our great independent bookstores, is here to sign the books. So we're just going to have a little conversation here. Comfy chairs, can people see?
Not TD band.
Yeah. All right, so we talked about C18 here in Canada, and I think most Canadians are unaware that we have our national parliament doing second reading on the Agricultural Growth Act. And we know the president of the National Farmers Union here is here, and he's speaking at our conference tomorrow. Yeah, we're going to applause for the so their petitions are going to be on the outside. But at the heart of what's going on in that is an international convention, the ADVOCACY 91. So if you can talk about that and how that's been pushed by corporations around the world and the implications for us here in Canada.
So until 1995, globally, seed could not be patented. That's what Monsanto put in place. But there was an earlier French law, originally French, called UPOP, which is a breeders' rights law, and it had an early version, which had exemptions for farmers and exemptions for breeders. That the breeder could do some work and then have a breeder's rights, but it was not at the cost of the farmer, and it was not at the cost of scientists who were breeding. Around the time when the patent laws were being put in place, UPOP was modified into what is called UPOP 91. Now, every country is being told this is a requirement of the World Trade Organization. It is not, because these articles on patenting and breeders' rights were so controversial that countries of the South, led by India, put patent or a sui generis system. So UPOP is not an obligation. Any government that says they've got to implement UPOP is lying to you. Second, in the sui generis option, we drafted a law, and I was asked to be on the expert group that drafted it, where instead of just having it as plant variety protection, which ends up being breeders' rights, we made it plant variety protection and farmers' rights. And farmers' rights to save, exchange, improve, breed, sell seed was made non-alienable. No law could change that. The farmers' rights came first, because all seeds have come from nature and been bred by farmers. So for C18, I would suggest you do what was done in India to find a similar law in 2004, where Monsanto tried to undercut the farmers' rights and make a similar law. And we did a satyagraha across the country. Satyagraha is Gandhi's word for the force of truth. And force of truth today is against corporate rule based on fictions. Rule of falsehood, one would say. The falsehood that these companies create the seed, and therefore they have a monopoly, and therefore from the harvest of the farmer, they can force a farmer to pay royalty. No, it's the farmer's labor, and the labor of the seed that has given us the crop, not the corporations. So we've done a seed satyagraha. We killed that law in India in 2004. 2nd October to 16th October, we celebrate a fortnight of seed and food freedom. Just to concentrate our energies, to connect across the world, to build up solidarity. And we're calling on people around the world to not cooperate with and declare a satyagraha against laws like C18. If you start doing that now and send those postcards today, and show that it's part of a global movement to reclaim seed as a commons, to reclaim seed freedom, which for me is three things. The freedom of the seed itself as a living being, in its diversity, integrity, and its evolutionary potential. The freedom of the farmer to save and exchange seed, and to have their contribution to breeding recognized, and the freedom of the eater to get good food, because without good seed, there's no good food. And one of the curses of our time is bad food. Begins in bad seed. So how can we reward the people who are ruining our food system with monopolies? That should just not be on. We've got to reclaim the commons. So remember, October 2nd, do a massive satyagraha.
So we thank you for doing that. We're all leaders after all, so this is part of our conference, and there are people outside of the entry table. So, Father, I know that this work is incredibly challenging, and we are up against some very large forces that are out there. And in preparation for your introduction, I looked at the Wikipedia site. You told me yesterday about how corporations are even trying to change your Wikipedia site. So what sort of experiences have you had in terms of the challenges that corporations have given to you and as a key activist?
Well, when Monsanto first entered India with its illegal GMO cotton seeds, I sued them. And I got threats of the most severe kinds. So what I did was make lots of copies of my lecture. I said, even if they do something to me and bump me off, at least the case should reach the court. And I told all my friends, there's one in this file and there's one in so-and-so's home. One of you should reach the courts.